The impulse to redress historical wrongs is not fundamentally a bad thing. I would say that, of course, justice is a very important virtue, to strive for. But the understanding, you see, but what has happened practically, what has happened, while the impulse and the intent is a pure intent and a pure impulse, that yes, you want to redress some of the wrongs of a past history. Practically, what tends to happen is that these kinds of positive discrimination programs end up becoming weapons. They become political weapons. They become weaponized by the politicians. And so they inevitably fail to achieve what they are supposed to achieve, which is a true leveling of the playing field and a true redressal of past grievances. So this has been well established even in America. Affirmative action in America has not worked. I think that a dharmic perspective would certainly wish to address the condition of the marginalized, but at the same time, not allow any solution to be hijacked by political gaming, which is typically what ends up happening when you try to do positive discrimination. Is that positive discrimination is not effectively done. Now, because it gets politicized, also positive discrimination produces a lot of creates a lot of difficulties for those who you are currently discriminating against. When I see Brahmins in Tamil Nadu, their condition is essentially one of they live in fear, and because they have been vilified, and for at least 70, 80 years. So when politics hijacks positive discrimination efforts, then this is what happens. You get a devolution of the ends to which positive discrimination could have been applied. Okay, if you want to measure economic activity that is happening in a country, then GDP is a fine measure and there is no need to change it. However, if you believe that, like I said in my talk also, I said that public welfare, modern day Western public policy equates public welfare with economic well-being, and it equates economic well-being with GDP. Now, if it is economic well-being that you're concerned about, then GDP is a fine enough measure. There is no need to change it. However, economic well-being, I would argue, is only one aspect or one dimension of well-being. And where public policy, modern day public policy, often fails is in giving too much importance to that one dimension, and therefore GDP becomes the summary indicator of progress in a country. And I would argue that that is wrong. Basically, the dollar is where it is today because America pretty much won the Second World War. If America had not won the Second World, basically, of course, Britain also won the Second World War, France also won the Second World War, but America won it in the sense that by the end of the Second World War, all of these other allied countries were in debt to the United States. So the United States was in a very privileged economic position, at the end of the Second World War, and that allowed it to, in some sense, claim for the dollar a place in the world economy of that time that has, at least for the last 70, 80 years, continued to remain unchallenged mostly. But you never know, over the next 20 years, 30 years, if the geopolitics of the world shifts quite dramatically, then other currencies could also come to the fore and displace the dollar from its privileged position.
Namaste and good evening to all the viewers that have joined us today, and I welcome you to another episode of Indic Talks organized by the Center for Indic Studies in this university. Today, we shall delve into why the public policy is in crisis. The talk will explain how it is in crisis, why it is in crisis, and what can be done about it. All of this from a Sanatan Dharmic perspective. To help us look at the issue at hand from a Dharmic lens, we have our expert today, Dr. Indradeep Ghosh, who is a sadhak. He holds a PhD in economics from MIT and has lived and taught in the US of A for many years. He returned to India in 2015 and is currently working in the policy domain. I welcome you, sir, and I request you to take over from here.
Thank you, Ojasvi, and namaste, everybody. I'm Indradeep. So today we are here to talk about public policy, and in particular, I want to look at public policy through a dharmic lens. So that is the subject of this talk. And since I'm sharing my screen, I can't see if anybody's asking questions, Ojasvi. So please feel free to stop me and ask a question. I'm happy to take questions while I'm giving the talk.
Okay.
So rather than
So
finish the talk
typically,
and
how we'll do it is that you'll finish the lecture and I'll have an
then
accumulated question list.
okay, good. Okay, so first I just start by paying respects to my guru and also Ganapati. So Om Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha, Om Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha, Om Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha, Om Vakratunda Mahakaya Surya Koti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada. So namaste, everybody. This is the plan of the talk. What is public policy and what is India's experience? This is what I will speak about first. Then I will say that I will claim that public policy is in crisis today, and I will explain why and how. And then I will diagnose the problem as fundamentally one of public policy ignoring culture. So there is no room for culture in public policy today. And there never has been, by the way. And so this has created the crisis, in my view. And that will then take us to the question of why culture is needed, why culture is so important for public policy to take note of, and then in particular, what can Dharmic culture offer? So what is public policy? Any activity undertaken by the executive branch of the state for public welfare is public policy. So that is the definition of public policy that I will be working with today. Let me repeat, any activity undertaken by the executive branch of the state for public welfare. By executive branch, I basically mean in India, for instance, the bureaucracy. Of course, public policy is crafted by legislators, politicians in consultation with bureaucrats. But ultimately, public policy is implemented by bureaucrats in our country. And so that is why I say any activity undertaken by the executive branch. And the objective of this activity is to enhance public welfare. By state, I mean democracies. So I just want to be clear about that. And by public welfare, I mean mostly economic well-being. So these are some of the definitions I just want to lay out before we delve into public purpose. I want to, of course, put some boundaries on what I mean by public policy and what kinds of countries I'm talking about when I say public policy. Economic well-being, which is mainly the objective of public policy pretty much everywhere around the world, especially in democracies, is measured exclusively in monetary terms. So this is an important point to note because we'll keep coming back to this idea that public welfare is mostly economic well-being, and economic well-being is mostly measured in monetary terms. And so this is a very important idea that we will keep coming back to during the course of this talk because it is a central problem with the nature of public policy today. All of the above applies to contemporary India. So in India also, public policy is basically undertaken by the executive branch of the state for public welfare. And public welfare is economic well-being. Economic well-being is measured in monetary terms. So for instance, gross domestic product is one measure of economic well-being at the level of the entire country. And then if you divide that by population, you get GDP per capita. So that is a measure of economic well-being at the level of the individual citizen. And then there are various other types of monetary measures of economic well-being that we can list. Now, in India, public policy has been, independent India has been doing public policy since it gained independence. But the nature of public policy has undergone some shifts over the course of the last 70 plus years. So in the first 30 years after independence, that is from 1947 roughly to about 1980, economic well-being mostly meant economic growth via industrialization and poverty alleviation. So these were the two objectives of public policy: economic growth, and it was primarily pursued through industrialization, and poverty alleviation. So the alleviation of poverty to get people from below the poverty line to above the poverty line. That is what I mean by poverty alleviation. And the policy approach was a socialist planning approach. So India embarked, as many of you may know, India embarked on 5-year plans or 5-year planning. And every 5 years, the Planning Commission, which still exists, by the way, but today it is called Niti Aayog. Earlier, it used to be called Planning Commission. The Planning Commission would draw up a 5-year plan for what the next 5-year plan should, what the next 5 years should look like, what kinds of objectives public policy should pursue, etc., etc. But in all of these 5-year plans that were drawn up in the first 30 years after independence, economic well-being always meant economic growth, industrialization, and poverty alleviation. And by socialist planning, I mean that the state took upon itself most of the responsibility for pursuing economic growth and also for pursuing poverty alleviation. By the state, I mean the government. So this is what it means for public policy to be socialist in nature. Economic liberalization began in the 1980s and then it intensified in the 1990s and thereafter. By liberalization, I mean that slowly the state began to cede ground to the marketplace, to private enterprise, and to markets. This was the kind of liberalization that actually several countries in the developing world began to slowly embark upon during the 1980s and 1990s, and India was prominent among them. 1991, for instance, was a very big year for India when India announced a major set of economic reforms. All of these economic reforms were meant to allow the state to take a step back from the economic sphere and to allow private markets and private enterprise to take its place in the economic sphere. So several industries that had been nationalized, several sectors that had been nationalized in the first 30 years began to be privatized after the 1980s and 1990s, such as telecom, civil aviation, uh, electrical, utilities, many utilities, etc. Now, in the 2000s, the goals remain the same: economic growth and poverty alleviation. So in some sense, the objectives of public policy has not economic growth, even though the markets have a responsibility for delivering economic growth and poverty alleviation, the state continues to play a role. But like I said, it is nowhere as central as it used to be before the 1980s. So this is a very, very quick and brief history of public policy in India. Now I want to say that why public policy is in crisis. How is it in crisis? Public policy actually everywhere is hitting hard limits, not just in India, but also in the rest of the world. The conventional Western model of public policy, which is really the model of public policy that has been in vogue for at least the last 70, 80 years, if not longer, this model of public policy, which is a Western model originated in advanced developed countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and continental Europe. This model of public policy has not been much of a success anywhere. Public policy problems are getting more complex and more insoluble, if not worsening with time. And what are the critical problems that the conventional Western model of public policy has to address? If you look at the last 70, 80 years of public policy making, the typical problems that public policy has sought to address are problems such as inequality, problems like environmental degradation, problems like public health, etc. Now, what I'm saying here is that these problems are not be getting solved. They are only getting more complex and more insoluble. So income inequality and wealth inequality has only exacerbated, it has only increased over the last 70, 80 years, not just in India, but everywhere around the world, and especially in the Western world. Similarly, environmental degradation has continued. If anything, it has accelerated over the course of the last 80 years. And today we are looking at extreme climate events, extreme weather events, climate change, etc. So these are just two examples of big public policy issues that, despite 70, 80 years of trying, public policy has not been able to retire these problems. These problems continue to exist, and if anything, they are even worse today than they were in the past. Some of you may know that the United Nations in 2015 adopted something called Sustainable Development Goals. And the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, these are meant to be the goals of public policy everywhere around the world. And alongside these goals, something like 150 plus metrics or indicators have been developed to understand if the world is actually moving towards these goals or not. And it turns out that 2030 is the deadline for all the countries in the world to achieve these goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. But we are almost 10 years since these Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And we have about 6 years to go till the deadline. It turns out that among the 150 plus metrics, progress on a full 30% has either stalled or reversed, meaning that the indicators have become worse, not better. And on another 40%, progress is weak and insufficient. So clearly, again, this is evidence that public policy is not working. If the goal of public policy was to achieve these SDGs, then clearly it is failing, not just in India, but everywhere around the world. The fundamental contradiction that public policy still is unable to address, or perhaps unwilling to address, is that economic growth continues to be an imperative for public policy, but the world, the planet as we know, has finite ecological resources. So this idea of compounded economic growth is running up, is hitting up against hard finite ecological constraints. And this fundamental contradiction, how is the world, how is the planet going to continue to grow economically if its ecological resources are finite? This question has not been addressed by public policy anywhere in the world. And this is the fundamental contradiction as at the heart of public policy, and also I would argue one of the reasons that public policy is in crisis today. In fact, experts say that the current moment in public policy is a moment of reckoning, if not a moment of full-blown crisis. But the Western world appears to be in denial. So what are the weaknesses? So why is public policy in crisis? Let me sort of now diagnose the problem. So I hope I have been able to persuade you that public policy is in crisis. And I've also noted some evidence of why of how public policy is in crisis. But let me now come to the why. Why is public policy in crisis? What is the problem? What is the core of the issue? So I would argue that there are three critical weaknesses. Okay. The first weakness or the first shortcoming is that the underlying model or the conceptual thinking in public policy, conventional Western public policy, proceeds from a set of assumptions that are deeply problematic, if not plain wrong. So, a lot of public policy is founded on theoretical foundations that I am arguing are deeply problematic, if not plain wrong. Secondly, the practical implications of starting from these problematic assumptions is to commit three mistakes. One mistake is to mistake the particular for the universal. I will explain that later, what it means to mistake the particular for the universal. The second mistake is to mistake monetary value for actual value. And the third mistake is to mistake economics for ethics. And we will see how Dharmic culture will fix each of these mistakes. Okay. Because that is what, if these are the problems, then we will find that Dharmic culture is very well suited to fix all of these problems. Okay. And then the third problem is that public policy is culture blind, and culture is how people make meaning in their lives. So the fact that public policy is culture blind means that public policy has no meaning for most people. In fact, the very people that public policy is looking to serve, it is not really serving because it is not offering meaningful policy solutions for people's lives and problems. So now I will go into each of these three critical weaknesses in a little more depth so that we can unpack each of these a little more carefully. So first, let's look at the wrong model. That public policy at its very core starts with the wrong understanding of the human subject. It starts with the wrong understanding of who the human subject is. So in the background is, of course, the rational enlightenment that started in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the background is that, the individual is assumed to be supreme and is assumed to be able to subdue an unruly nature by exercising reason. So this is the fundamental premise of the rational enlightenment, that the individual is everything. And it is the individual's duty and responsibility to bring an unruly nature under his or her control by using reason. And reason is supposed to be something that is God-given to the individual. But at the same time, the individual is not supposed to rely on God. Individual is supposed to rely on reason. And similarly, truth, including ethical truths, is achieved through a consensus of reasoning individuals. These are the two fundamental, I would say, axioms of the rational enlightenment. Now, it turns out that economic theory is also rooted in these axioms. So, for instance, one of the axioms, one of the foundational principles of economic theory is individualism. The idea that the individual is supreme and that the collective is merely an aggregate of individuals. And I will show how Dharmic culture does not see the collective in this way at all. The collective is not simply an aggregate of individuals. Secondly, economic theory is rooted in the rationality axiom, which is the idea that means are chosen to achieve ends efficiently. Okay. There are a certain set of ends or objectives or goals that we are seeking to achieve. And the idea of rationality is that you will always choose the pathway or the means to achieving those goals in a way that your choices gets you to those goals in the fastest, shortest possible manner, which is to say that you are choosing means efficiently in order to achieve it. So efficiency is a very important quality that the rational enlightenment privileges. And then thirdly, economic theory is empirical, meaning that it can only conceptualize ideas that correspond to observable and measurable phenomena. So if something is not observable or something is not measurable, it is not considered important. It is not even conceptualized. So for example, even though we know that the human subject has a subconscious mind which affects and influences a lot of his or her decision making, Even though we know that the subconscious mind is important, economic theory has nothing to say about this aspect of the mind. Why? Because it is not observable and it is not measurable. So these are some of the uh, basic founding principles or axioms of economic theory. Now, it turns out, and some of you may already know this, that these axioms really originate in the natural science disciplines like physics, chemistry, etc. And so, in imposing these axioms on economic theory, what is sought to be done is that the reality that apparently economic theory is trying to explain is like a physical reality. So materialism is yet another cornerstone of economic theory, that the economic theory is only concerned with the material world. And it believes that that material world operates according to laws that can be discovered, just like physical reality operates according to laws that can be discovered, such as Newton's law or various other kinds of laws. Similarly, the belief is that economic theory can also uncover laws by which the material world uh, operates. So basically, economics becomes a science of social engineering, as if social reality is a machine-like reality, as if it is a mechanical reality. Okay. So here I'm trying to describe what happens when you begin with these kinds of problematic foundations of individualism, rationality, empiricism, etc. You end up with a science which is an engineering science. Okay. Um, Yet all of this development and sophistication, and by the way, I'm describing the history of the development of economic thinking from the 18th century all the way to the present day. All of this development and sophistication hid a fundamental paradox at the core of economic theory. The core of economic theory is this paradox, which is that it aims to discover laws by which a sovereign actor behaves. Now, why is this a paradox? It is a paradox because a sovereign individual, by definition, is free, is sovereign, and therefore should not be behaving according to laws. But that is the science of economic theory. That is the conceit of economic theory, that it will be able to discover laws, like, for example, the law of demand, by which a sovereign individual. So this is the fundamental contradiction or the fundamental paradox at the core of economic theory. Now, how does it's not as if economic theory is unaware of this paradox. How is the paradox resolved? I would argue that the paradox is resolved in a counterfeit manner, meaning it is resolved in an unsatisfactory manner. And the way it is resolved is that the individual, and those of you who study economics may understand what I'm saying here, it's a slightly technical point, that the individual is endowed with what is called a utility function, and the individual is told that you have to maximize utility. But there is no discussion about what goes inside the utility function. In other words, there is no discussion about what are the ends of maximizing utility. What are the goals? What are the ultimate objectives? What are the ultimate goals? What are the ultimate ends to which an individual should dedicate himself or devote himself or herself? So the individual must maximize utility. The individual has a utility function. But what goes inside the utility function, there is no discussion about that. So effectively, what this means is that ends or goals become random or exogenous. In theory, ends are not discussed and ends become random or exogenous. We will find that in practice, ends become money. But in theory, ends are random or exogenous. So, so that's critical weakness number one. Critical weakness number two is that economic theory makes three or public policy, and remember, all of public policy is being driven by economic theory, because economics, among all of the academic disciplines, has an outsized influence on public policy. It is the one social science which influences public policy to the greatest extent. The other social sciences like psychology or sociology or anthropology do not really have that much of an influence on public policy and public policy makers. Uh, so what happens when you have a wrong model? You end up committing three kinds of mistakes. The first kind of mistake is that you mistake the particular for the universal. And this means taking empirical learnings from one context and believing that they transpose easily to other contexts, or treating context as being irrelevant. So this is again stated differently. This is the impulse to universalize everything. That what works in the United States must also work in India, or what works in Rajasthan must also work in Tamil Nadu, or what works in a village must also, or what works in a city must also work in a village. So context is rendered irrelevant, and this is how public policy commits mistakes, by basically mistaking the particular for the universal. In other words, public policy is not sufficiently attuned to the particular, to the specifics of the situation, of the problem that it is looking to solve. Secondly, and this is a big one, uh, both economic theory and public policy mistake monetary value for actual value. Now, what does this mean? It basically means that money is the only value, or it is rather the origin of value, all value. If something cannot be translated into monetary value, it possesses no value. So this is another way to see it, that we live in a society where monetary value is considered to be true value. And if something cannot be monetized, it possesses no value. Okay, so there is no value independent of monetary value. We will, of course, see that Dharmic culture completely disagrees with this proposition that monetary value is the source of all value. But this is one of the problems that has arisen because of the nature of economic theory and the nature of public policy, that we mistake monetary value for actual value. There are other ways in which I can explain this point. So take for instance, a situation where you walk into an electronics goods store and you want to buy a washing machine, and you don't really know what the technical features of the washing machine are. But you know that you want a washing machine which is fairly technically sophisticated. Well, what you could do is you could look at the price tag on different models, and you could be fairly sure, fairly confident that as the prices increase, the washing machines get more and more technically sophisticated. So there, in that context, it is indeed the case that monetary value is signaling actual value, because as prices increase, you can be confident that the quality of the washing machine you will buy is also increasing or is also improving. But the problem is that this same logic is extended to every other sphere of life as well in modern Western capitalism. That every other sphere of life also operates according to the same logic. So how this creates problems? Imagine that you wanted to understand what is the most important research question in physics. And maybe you assemble a group of physicists and you try to you engage, you have them talk it out between themselves, and maybe they arrive at a consensus or maybe they don't. Most likely they will not arrive at a consensus as to what is the most valuable or what is the most important research question in physics. Well, no problem. What you could instead do, instead of relying on physicists to give you the answers, you could go to the National Science Foundation's website. The National Science Foundation is the agency in the United States that disburses government funding for research projects in various academic disciplines. You could go to the National Science Foundation's website and find out which research project in physics is getting the most money, is getting the most funding. And you could infer from that that must be the most valuable question in physics. But is that the case? Is it the case that just because a research project is attracting a lot of monetary funding, it is by that very fact the most valuable? Of course not. I mean, if you don't have to think hard in order to realize that that is not how you would evaluate the value or importance of a, say, physics research project. So this is the problem. When monetary value becomes the origin of all value, then you make these kinds of mistakes, that if you apply the same logic in every sphere of life, you end up confusing yourself, and you end up making all sorts of bad decisions also. Similarly, and a closely allied problem is that you mistake economics for ethics, or you mistake means for ends. Economics is not a science of ends. Like I said, ends are random or exogenous, but one of means. And if you think of what money is a means. Money is not an end in itself. But you see, when money value becomes the signal of real value, then money becomes an end in itself. And this is another problem that arises in modern day public policy, that because money offers itself as something that can be easily circulated, because of its utility, because of its tangibility, because of its immediacy, because of its universality, money becomes an end in itself. And so you mistake economics for ethics. Now, what does this mean? It means that money has replaced God. Money has replaced the sacred. You see, what is the sacred? One way of defining what is the sacred is uh, that which demands our time, that which demands our care, that which demands our attention, that which demands our love, that which demands our devotion. That is what we call sacred, right? The sacred is what demands our time, care, attention, love, devotion. Now ask yourself, what is that thing that is demanding our time, care, attention, love, and devotion in today's world? It is money. So money has replaced the sacred, money has replaced God. Okay, this is what it means to say that money is the value of all values, economics has replaced ethics. Finally, the third critical weakness, economics is culture blind because economists cannot measure or quantify culture. So public policy actually does not understand culture. It does not understand community. It does not understand institutions because it does not understand culture. Culture is upstream of community and institutions. So community is not merely an aggregate of individuals. Community is individuals plus a ritual. Okay. Rituals are an integral feature of community, but public policy does not understand community in that sense. Public policy does not understand that institutions are not merely rules or constraints or contracts, but rather institutions embody ethics. And ethics cannot be reduced to rules or constraints or contracts. Again, I'm stating these problems in a slightly abstract manner, but hopefully my audience is able to understand or comprehend what this means. You know, the idea that public policy does not understand community, does not understand institutions. And yet, if you think about what policymakers constantly say, they say that, oh, we are trying to benefit the community. We are trying to build great institutions. Well, if you don't understand the substance of what a community is or what an institution is, how are you going to benefit the community and how are you going to build good institutions? The fundamental lesson from anthropology is ignored by both economic theory and public policy, which is that people do not behave rationally. They behave meaningfully, meaning they act in ways that have meaning for them. I act in ways that have meaning for me. That may or may not appear rational to somebody else, but if it has meaning for me, then that is enough. Okay. And what is it that helps us to make meaning? It is culture. Culture, in one way to define culture, is that culture is the kind of symbolic logic by which we make meaning for ourselves. So culture is, let me repeat that, culture is a kind of symbolic logic by which we make meaning for ourselves. And so since public policy ignores culture, since it is culture blind, clearly the absence of culture deprives public policy of any proper meaning. And so it's not surprising that public policy therefore systematically fails, because policymakers cannot really reach the ordinary person who is striving for meaning. Public policy is not offering anything useful to the ordinary person. Now, to say that public policy is culture blind is not to say that public policy is not influenced by culture. It is, but it is influenced by culture in a non-reflexive way, in an unself-conscious way. So therefore, The only aspects of culture which actually influence public policy are the fleeting and transient aspects of culture, which are those derived from monetary exchange. You can imagine that many things we do with money are also cultural in nature. But there are many things we do which are much deeper than that. But it is monetary exchange which determines, which ultimately creates all of the meaning, all of the value, and all of the culture for us. So since culture is learned and transmitted through imitation and emulation, that is how culture is learned. That is how culture is transmitted through imitation, through emulation. That is how children learn their parents' culture, through imitation and emulation. So if the parents, for instance, are not dharmic, then the children will not imbibe any dharmic culture because the children are not seeing their parents behave in ways that are dharmic or perform in ways that are dharmic. So since culture is learned and transmitted through imitation and emulation, what is the one thing that offers itself easily for circulation? It is money. So monetary exchange becomes the bearer of value, meaning, and culture, and everybody strives to imitate those who have money. So basically, our role models are all the rich people in the world. Those are our role models. This is one way to reframe what I'm saying here. That because culture is learned and transmitted through imitation, emulation, because money offers itself easily for circulation, monetary exchange becomes the bearer of value, meaning, and culture. And we begin to attribute value, we begin to attribute meaning, we begin to attribute worth to those who have money. In fact, we learn our ethics from them, not from our gurus and swamis and rishis, but from those who have money. So, Bollywood actors, cricket players, cricket stars are the ones who are dictating to us what we should be striving for, what we should be attributing value to, what we should be thinking of culture. So these are the problems. So what I will say is that introduce culture. How do you solve these problems? Let culture and not money speak ethics. And thus only those aspects of culture that are deep, enduring, and have survived evolutionary selection and adaptation allow those aspects of culture, not money, to dictate ethics. And if you do this, each of the three mistakes can be corrected. At the highest and deepest level, ends will be treated as distinct and independent of means, and this opens the space for a proper consideration of ethics. And this is the million-dollar question. Who is qualified to speak ethically? Who speaks ethically? Because it's not like anybody can speak ethically. You have to be qualified to speak ethically. You have to have the adhikar to be able to speak ethics. Today, we live in a world where if you have money, that qualifies you to speak ethically. So we think that whoever has money is also the person that we should be listening to, paying attention to, spending our time thinking about and listening to. But who is qualified to speak ethically? Okay, now I come to dharmic culture. So now is the last part of my talk. What is dharmic culture? First, I will define dharmic culture, and then I will show how dharmic culture can fix all of these issues, all of these problems that I have previously touched on. What are the problems? The problems are that ends are not properly defined. Ends are confused with means. Since means are basically money, money becomes an end in itself, and money begins to dictate all value. Money has replaced the divine. Money has become sacred. Okay, so what is dharmic culture? I will summarize dharmic culture in 5 or 6 different propositions, and I hope that this summary of dharmic culture resonates with the audience. Of course, the audience may think that there are aspects of dharmic culture that I've overlooked or that I've missed in my summary, but broadly, I would argue that these are some of the key tenets or key beliefs of dharmic culture. The first thing is multiple lifetimes. We don't believe that you only live once. We believe that you have multiple lifetimes, and fundamentally, the human subject represents a capacity for divinity. which is really freedom or liberation, moksha, from the working of karma. So that is our understanding of the human subject. Our understanding of the human subject is not that that the human subject is an individual and supreme, even above God, and that the human subject's sole purpose is to bring an unruly nature under his or her control. That is not our understanding of the human subject. Our understanding of the human subject, dharmic understanding, is that the human subject fundamentally represents divinity, has the capacity for divinity, though the human subject may not be embodying that capacity, but that capacity is there. And when the human subject is able to embody that capacity, then the human subject gains freedom or liberation from the working of karma. We also believe that the highest form of help a human being can receive is the kind of help that will help the human subject or the human being to gain moksha, to gain that condition of freedom. And therefore, we give the greatest importance to the guru, because the guru is the person who will help us get to that place of freedom or liberation. So guru is already embodying that truth. Guru is already embodying that freedom, that liberation. And so the guru is indispensable for achieving that condition of freedom. And the guru gives us the help. And since that is the highest form of help we can receive, the guru is the most important person for an individual, is also the call to discipline. And we think because the guru is embodied truth and embodied, we give a very, very high importance to embodied truth. You know, the Western world gives a lot of importance to disembodied truth. Disembodied truth is truth you can put in textbooks, you know. So, but we give a lot of importance to truth that is lived, that is embodied. And and that truth is self-authenticating and self-legitimating, meaning you don't have to perform experiments to understand if that is true or not. Whatever that embodied, that the person who is living the truth, and by truth we mean moksha, the condition of freedom, the condition of liberation from the workings of karma. When a person begins to embody that liberation and freedom within himself or herself, then that embodiment is its own proof. It is self-authenticating and self-legitimating. We believe that the human condition is shot through and through with contingency. Contingency just means that you never know what is going to happen to you. Okay. The working of karma also admits contingency, and it's very difficult for a human being to understand what is their karma, what kinds of karmic forces are working out through them. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna that deep flows the river of karma. You know, Gahanno karmana gati. Deep flows the, meaning that it's not easy for a human being to understand what karmic streams and what karmic forces are working through them. So therefore, the human being has to rely on certain things like devas, rituals, practices. These are things that the human being relies on in order to face contingency, in order to live life. And so lived reality is a politics and ethics of contingency mediated by the sacred. This, I would argue, this a sentence which I've put in bold, I would argue is one of the central tenets of Dharmic culture, which is that the everyday life is basically us going through life, experiencing contingency, which is created by karma, and our experience of that contingency that is created by our karmas, some of which may be known to us, but most of which is unknown to us, we make sense of using the sacred, using the idea of the sacred. So the sacred mediates our experience of reality. So given that that is dharmic culture, now let me connect the two streams, dharmic culture and public policy. So first of all, dharmic culture has very well-defined ends, not like Western public policy where money is the end and money is the sole end. There's no other end. Dharmic culture has well-defined ends. Money is one of the four ends. Artha, kama, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Moksha is as important, if not more important, than kama and artha, but at least it is as important as artha and kama. So the four purusharthas well-defined ends. We have well-defined stages of life, the four ashramas for each individual. That means an individual's journey through life has also been mapped out very, very carefully. This is a template that we have for any human subject, that any human subject can legitimately apply themselves to the pursuit of the four purusharthas and can legitimately structure their life according to the four ashramas. Okay. Dharmic culture is a well-defined idea of community. Like I said earlier, public policy does not understand community. Dharmic culture is a well-defined idea of community and society, the Varna Jati system, and the roles of individual within the community and of the community within the society. Okay. So that embedding is very well understood in Dharmic culture. Whereas in the Western model, the individual is alone supreme and the community is merely just an aggregate of individuals. That's it. Now, this is the most important part. Who is qualified to speak ethically? Western culture says those who have money. Okay. Western culture says that Elon Musk, that's why everybody follows Elon Musk on X, and he gets to decide who is saying, who is right and who is wrong, and who we should believe and trust and who we should not. Okay. But in our culture, we say that Shabda or testimony is a valid method of knowing, but whose Shabda? Whose testimony? Not anybody's testimony or anybody's Shabda. It is the Shabda of Rishis, of Swamis, of Gurus. They are the ones who are qualified to speak ethically. Not the businessman, not the successful cricketer or the actor, but the Guru, the Rishi, the Swami, they are qualified to speak ethically. So we also have a good answer to this question. If we want to look for ethics, who do we go to? We go to the gurus, we go to the rishis, we go to the swamis, we go to the texts, we go to the shastras. We also have well-defined qualities or attributes for the policymaker to embody. By the way, this is a critical failing of Western public policy, that nowhere in Western public policy you will see a description of the desirable attributes of the policymaker. You know, what are the qualities or attributes that the policymaker should embody? This is well laid out in Dharmic culture. In Artha Shastra is a long list of qualities that the policymaker should embody. Cyclical aspect of time. So Western model of public policy subscribes to a linear model of time. Time's arrow goes from the past to the future, and so the 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 vision is one of uh, continuing advancement and progress always. Whereas we subscribe to cyclical aspect of time, that is, time is cyclical and the world is caught up in cycles, natural cycles. We are caught up in our own biological rhythms and cycles. And so the idea of ordered repetition as a way of understanding and appreciating both the human subject's relationship to the natural world and also that subject's responsibility to that world is how we bring cyclical understanding of time into our lives. Okay. So if, for example, every morning I get up and I light a diya for my Ishta Devata, that is respecting the cyclical nature of time because it is a ritual I do every morning. Okay. So this understanding that time is cyclical and that human beings live their lives according to ordered repetition is a very, very central to Dharmic culture. It is not at all central to the Western understanding of the human subject. So this kind of approach to thinking about the human subject's relationship to nature and also that subject's responsibility to the natural world means that our understanding of the environment is always already integral and sustainable. We don't have anything called externalities. You see, in the Western model, nature is, human activity is considered to have to impose externalities on the environment. And then all of public policy has to do with, okay, how do I minimize those externalities? Whereas in the dharmic approach, the human being is considered to be integrated with nature. And so there is no such thing as externalities. So the dharmic approach to the environment is always already sustainable. And the question of sustainability does not even arise, because from the very beginning, the approach is to think about nature as an extension of the human subject, and of the human subject as an extension of nature. So the two are co-extensive, we say, co-extensive. Okay. Uh, Dharma codifies guidance on all aspects of life in the world, whether it is value system, whether it is phases or stages of life, whether it is daily rhythms of the human world, of the natural world, whether it is education, whether it is teaching, whether it is social institutions, whether it is jurisprudence, statecraft, political economy. We have dharmic codification of all of these aspects of life. And so it provides a complete system of thinking that can be applied for human beings to live a life where they are pursuing the four purusharthas, they are living those four stages of life, and they are organized into communities and societies according to a Varna Jati system. Okay. Finally, this is my last slide. I will say that the world today is caught up in a clash of civilizations. You know, on the one side, you have secular, bottom up. Why do I say bottom up? See, in democracies, who makes law? In democracies, politicians make law. But who elects politicians? It is the citizens. So that is why citizens elect politicians and politicians enact law. So that's what I'm calling bottom up. Democratic lawmaking is a bottom up system. Okay. And on the other side, you have the religious top down lawmaking. So God reveals the truth to some prophet. The prophet writes it down in a book, and that book becomes the source of all law. So a country like Iran, for instance, which is living with Sharia law. Where does the Sharia come from? The Sharia comes from the Quran. The Quran was revealed to the prophet by God. And in fact, it's not like the prophet wrote down the revelations. He was illiterate. He couldn't write. He used to come down from the cave. He used to be meditating in a cave, and the Archangel Gabriel would come to him and reveal God's truths to him. And he would then come home and repeat what he had heard to his wife, who wrote it down. So the Quran is the exemplar of religious top-down theocratic lawmaking. And the world today is caught between these two alternatives. The alternative of secular bottom-up democratic lawmaking, of which the US is the most shining example, and the alternative of religious top-down theocratic lawmaking, of which Iran is the most shining example. So between basically Christianity and Islam. Dharmic culture favors neither the one nor the other. Dharmic culture says that our rishis, swamis, and gurus, they can speak ethically. So they are the fount of an ethics. And the law that they embody, first of all, they embody it in their own behavior, in their own lives. The law that they embody is both human and divine. So it's not one or the other, it's both and. So this is where Dharmic culture offers a decisive advantage over these other two alternatives. Secular bottom-up democratic lawmaking, which, as I have described over the course of this presentation, is the source of a lot of the public policy. Misguided though it may be, that is its source. And then religious top-down theocratic lawmaking, there I have not described public policy because there's nothing to describe. It's all in the book. Everything about public policy is already given by God to the prophet. So there is no analysis after that. So Dharmic culture says neither of these two things is going to work. We are going to have to adopt a different idea of who the human subject is, namely that the human subject is basically the capacity for divine life. And we have to listen to the rishis, swamis, and gurus, because they are Only they are qualified to speak ethically. And from them, we can understand what should be the ends of public policy, and how society should be structured, what kind of rhythms of everyday life public policy should support, etc., and what kind of attributes or qualities the policymaker should have. All of this, what kind of educational institutions you should have to support this kind of striving, all of that, Dharmic culture has something to say about. And so, Dharmic society, I would say, is authentically pluralistic and admits authentic theological diversity. And this is what is needed for fixing all of the problems that I have described. Western public policy, which is the conventional model of public policy in vogue everywhere around the world. To fix all of that, we need a public policy which is rooted and anchored to Dharmic culture, which I've also described in this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very insightful talk and for simplifying something that can be quite hard to understand on our own. We'll move on to the question and answer section. There's a question about how the dharmic lens towards begging is very different. So while begging may be looked at very negatively in the Western construct, it isn't so in India. You know, whether it's the transgenders who, you know, we have come to our houses on auspicious occasions, or it is the street performers that we lend money to, it is often looked at from a very bad lens in the West, that it is it is an indication of poverty, which it
Yeah.
isn't. So, what is the dharmic lens towards bhiksha? Because that's very different from begging.
Yeah. So first of all, you have to understand the basic difference between the Dharmic lens and the Western lens at a very core metaphysical level. The difference is you only live once metaphysics and multiple lifetimes metaphysics. So when you only live once, then there is no proper explanation of why it is you were born into the circumstances into which you were born. It is called luck. And that is it. Luck is like a black box explanation for why somebody is born into the miserable circumstances that he or she is born into. That over time forces that person to become a beggar. So in a way, the Western uh, shaming of begging comes from two problems, two gaps in their thinking. One is that they think that they don't have a good explanation for why this person is begging. Why is this person in such a wretched condition that he or she has to beg? They don't have a good explanation, a good understanding of that, because they don't have this multiple life metaphysics. So they don't understand that the circumstances into which that person was born has over time led to that person being out on the streets begging. They don't understand that. So not understanding it, they kind of, they shun it. Okay. The other thing is they believe that every individual should be able to stand up on their own feet and fend for themselves. And any weakness is basically a demonstration of the lack of will. Okay. The lack of sovereign will, that too. Like I said, the Western understanding puts a lot of emphasis on sovereignty, on freedom, on liberty, right? So if you are free, then how come you're begging? You should be working somewhere. You should be exerting yourself, right? We don't have either of these two, uh, misconceptions. We understand that first of all, a person is born into the circumstances into which they are born because of past life karma. And there is a certain karmic journey that that person is on. And that has caused the person to take birth in whatever circumstances that that person has taken birth. So automatically we understand, first of all, that this person is is not able to exercise his sovereign will, because there is no such thing as sovereign will unless you actually work on yourself, unless you do yoga, unless you practice pranayama, unless you practice dhyana, how are you going to discover that sovereign will? So we understand that, and that then creates in within us a certain kind of acceptance of this person and their condition. We do not run away from it. We do not want to look away from it. The Westerner wants to look away from it because he or she does not understand it, has no framework within which that thing, that begging, can be understood. They can only understand it as either bad luck or as the lack of individual striving or the lack of individual effort, whereas we have a much richer understanding of why that person is begging. For all you know, the person could be a monk, and he or she could have renounced material, and therefore begging. In many monastic traditions, you have to beg for alms, and it is a way for the monk to learn about divine grace. So we have all of these understandings, so therefore we do not treat begging in the same way that the Western world treats begging.
So another question is about reservations. Oftentimes, what reservation has done, other than the obvious, is that it has brought a lack of shame in terms of your surname. So that has, while it has not done much with the spirit of division that may be in society, but it has done a lot towards the depletion of culture. Like if my surname is something, there is an occupation that is attached to it because I'm from a certain jati. And now, because development means to be sitting in a corporate office making money, now what my family legacy is something that becomes of secondary importance. So, emancipation clearly from the dharmic lens will not just be on the pecuniary aspects. So, what would emancipation of what we would call as the marginalized would be from a dharmic lens?
See, reservation is what is called positive discrimination, right? You're discriminating against those who you're discriminating in favor of those who had been earlier discriminated against, and you're discriminating against those who you believe in the past were favored, right? So in some sense, you are looking to redress uh, some wrongs that may have been committed in the past. Now, the impulse to redress historical wrongs is not fundamentally a bad thing. I would say that, of course, justice is a very important virtue, to strive for. But the understanding, you see, but what has happened practically, what has happened, while the impulse and the intent is a pure intent and a pure impulse, that yes, you want to redress some of the wrongs of a past history. Practically, what tends to happen is that these kinds of positive discrimination programs end up becoming weapons. They become political weapons. They become weaponized by the politicians. And so they inevitably fail to achieve what they are supposed to achieve, which is a true leveling of the playing field and a true redressal of past grievances. So this has been well established even in America. Affirmative action in America has not worked, and it is well documented that affirmative action has not worked. So, yes, while individual African Americans have taken advantage of the freedoms that they have been offered, uh, at, at a broad, large scale level, affirmative action has not worked. It has only made the Black African American community, and I lived in the United States for 17 years. So, and I saw with my own eyes the African American experience in the United States. Much of that African American experience is conditioned by these affirmative action programs, and they tend to keep African Americans in a state of dependence on the state. So this is the problem with reservations. Uh, I think that a dharmic perspective would certainly uh, wish to address the condition of the marginalized, but at the same time, not allow any solution to be hijacked by political uh, gaming, which is typically what ends up happening when you try to do positive discrimination, is that positive discrimination is not effectively done. Now, the way it, because it gets politicized, also positive discrimination produces a lot of creates a lot of difficulties for those who you are currently discriminating against. So for instance, I live in Chennai, and Tamil Nadu politics is very casteist. And positive discrimination in Tamil Nadu means that, and I can say it, I'm not a Brahmin myself, but I can say it that when I see Brahmins in Tamil Nadu, their condition is essentially one of they live in fear, and because they have been vilified and for at least 70, 80 years. So when politics hijacks positive discrimination efforts, then this is what happens. You get a devolution of the ends to which positive discrimination could have been applied. Does that answer
So
your question? So,
yes, absolutely it does.
okay.
Uh, Another question, sir, would be about the formalization of loan taking. There's a lot of celebration of the Mohammed Yunus, Grameen Bank model and all of that. So,
Hmm.
and our government policies are also targeted in such a way that, taking loans from the bank and increasing bank accounts is something that is much celebrated. And while, of course, that is important, do you think that the traditional way of lending is also something that should work in tandem?
What do you mean by traditional way of lending, though?
So
Informal lending?
yes,
Ah,
absolutely. So,
ah,
the ones that you'd be doing for the zamindars or whatever like that.
yeah. See, this is a very, very big question because you're asking about the phenomenon of debt itself, debt finance itself. All the world's religions have something to say about debt, about debt finance. The monotheistic religions certainly have a lot to say about debt finance, and one of them, namely Islam, completely bans debt finance. I don't know if you know this, but Islam bans all forms of debt finance. So debt is not considered to be a good thing in Islam. It is considered to be haram, actually. Now, there are reasons for that, and I don't want to go into the reasons for it. But nevertheless, that doesn't, even though the Quran bans debt finance, it is not the case that banks in Islamic countries do not lend. They find ways around that particular negative injunction, even though there is a very strong negative injunction against debt. So-called Islamic banking has found a way around it. Okay. And Muhammad Yunus himself is from an Islamic country, by the way. So now, when it comes to India, yes, I think on the one hand, formal finance, which is what you are referring to as debt from banks, debt from, say, public sector banks, private sector banks, microcredit institutions, non-bank finance companies, fintech lending, all of that. Um, while while all of that can help, especially poor people who would otherwise be excluded from these kinds of markets, the downside, the dark side of that is that it can also uh, end up over indebting, meaning poor people can end up becoming distressed because of the debt that they have taken on. Now, with informal lending, this can also happen. If the poor person is borrowing from the local money lender, money lenders typically charge exorbitant rates of interest. And uh, so it can also happen that the poor person is becomes over indebted. On balance, which one is better, which one is worse, is difficult to say. It's difficult to tell. Uh, but it is the case that even after 20 years of microcredit and microfinance, informal lending has not disappeared from India. It continues to exist, and it is a sizable chunk. If you look at Indian households, for instance, both rich and poor, both urban and rural, if you look at Indian households, you will find that almost 50% of their borrowing is from informal sources. And it turns out that approximately 1 out of every 5 loans in urban India, no, 1 out of every 5 loans in rural India, and 1 out of every 3 loans in sorry, it turns out that 1 out of every 5 informal loans in rural India and 1 out of every 3 informal loans in urban India are zero interest loans. Okay. Now, what does this tell you? It tells you that informal loans often tend to be given on more favorable terms than formal loans, because there is informal knowledge that those loans are riding on top of, So anyway, I mean, and then poor people especially, they typically use informal debt to take care of day-to-day, week-to-week expenses or medical expenses, for instance, emergency medical expenses. All of that is good because typically poor people don't have health insurance. So it's not like if they suddenly have some medical emergency, they can rely on their health insurance to bail them out. So typically, then they will have to go to their local money lender, or they have to go to some relative to borrow. So informal lending remains indispensable for Indian households. And despite 20-25 years of formal finance, uh, trying to eliminate informal finance altogether from the lives of the poor, that has not happened.
So another question, and correct me if I'm wrong. Japan uses a very different way of measuring its economic success than just nominal GDP. Uh, does it use the GNP instead?
Maybe it does, but there's not that much difference, really.
Okay.
You
So do you think we should also have another way of maybe measuring our economic success other than just the nominal GDP in terms of dollars, because it keeps fluctuating?
Um, I mean, GDP, it all depends. It all depends on what you are attempting to measure. Okay.
Hmm.
If you want to measure economic activity that is happening in a country, then GDP is a fine measure and there is no need to change it. However, if you believe that, like I said in my talk also, I said that public welfare, modern day Western public policy equates public welfare with economic well-being, and it equates economic well-being with GDP. Now, if if it is economic well-being that you're concerned about, then GDP is a fine enough measure. There is no need to change it. However, economic well-being, I would argue, is only one aspect or one dimension of well-being. And where public policy, modern day public policy often fails is in giving too much importance to that one dimension. And therefore, GDP becomes the summary indicator of progress in a country. And I would argue that that is wrong, definitely, because there are so many other possible dimensions along which you could measure a country or society's progress, aside from the purely economic. And so there, I think other kinds of indicators, not necessarily GDP, can be more meaningful or helpful. But that's how I would answer the question. I mean, I think when it comes, I mean, Japan is a whole other I mean, Japan has a very different kind of history. After the Second World War, it was humiliated by the Allied powers,
Mhm.
and so it really, over during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Japan really just put its nose to the grind and just uh, you know performed economically so that it could regain some of the honor
Mm.
that it had lost during the Second World War. So that history pretty much frames to current Japanese life and Japanese uh, uh, measurement systems. So you have
Mm.
to see it in that context. I don't think they have any better or worse system than we do. I mean, measurement system. I do think they definitely are an advanced economy, no doubt about that. Despite the fact that for the last 30 years they have not grown much economically. You know, from 1960 to 1990, the Japanese economy grew at about 6 or 7% per annum. When you compound 6 or 7% per annum over 30 years, that's a lot. That's
Yeah.
so that basically allowed them to become a developed, advanced country, advanced nation. But then since 1990, the growth rate has been 1% per annum or so for the last 30 years. So a country went from 6 to 7% per annum for 30 years to 1% per annum for the next 30 years. So the Japanese economy really has been in the doldrums for the last 30 years, but because it had already achieved a certain level of prosperity and progress by 1990, it has not degenerated into becoming a third world or developing country.
So then, sir, our efforts towards de-dollarization, how do they then fit into catering the Dharmic perspective in tandem with the GDP, nominal GDP measurement still being intact?
No, you can measure, see, if the Indian rupee becomes an important currency, an important world currency, and that will happen if India begins to trade more and more with the rest of the world. But also, to some extent, the rupee status and its privilege in the rest of the world also derives from geopolitical power. So, if India is able to amass a certain kind of geopolitical power, then the rupee will become an important currency. And then India does not need to report nominal GDP in dollar terms. It can report nominal GDP in rupee terms. You have to understand why the dollar is where it is today. The dollar is where it is today because everybody wants to report GDP in dollar terms, and every central bank wants to keep a stash of dollars primarily because of 100 you have to understand the last 150 years of international monetary history to understand why the dollar is where it is today. But to cut a long story short, basically the dollar is where it is today because America pretty much won the Second World War. If America had not won the Second War, basically, of course, Britain also won the Second World War, France also won the Second World War, but America won it in the sense that by the end of the Second World War, all of these other allied countries were in debt to the United States. So the United States was in a very privileged economic position, yeah, at the end of the Second World War, and that allowed it to, in some sense, uh, claim for the dollar a place in the world economy of that time that has, at least for the last 70, 80 years, continued to remain unchallenged mostly. But you never know over the next 20 years, 30 years, if the geopolitics of the world shifts quite dramatically, then other currencies could also come to the fore and displace the dollar from its privileged position. Now, this if that were to happen, if another currency were to come forward and displace the dollar from its privileged position, that displacement would not happen painlessly. America would fight tooth and nail to keep the dollar where it is. So you'd have immense wars before something like that were to change.
So another question was about the same thing that you highlighted about ethics and economics. How, when somebody is understood to be monetarily prosperous, then they seem to have the mic in hand to
Yeah.
tell what exactly morality should dictate in a society. So here, I think a woman's role becomes very unique to understand, especially from the household construct. It is pretty much the same once she is a part of the workforce. But when once she does, hold back and she becomes a housewife, then how exactly the dynamics of the home are supposed to remain? Because the head of the family is the man, because he's bringing in the money. So then how exact, because our economy does, rely a lot upon the household savings that housewives do. So that is a very indispensable role that they play. How does the
Household
dharma?
work, you mean?
Yes, no, the
Household.
savings, household savings that housewives do.
Okay.
Whether it's the gold that the house buys, or it's the
Yeah.
savings from the total income that are held back by the woman and then often taken care of as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So then
And
how exactly does the dharmic perspective look at women from A, when they enter into the workforce, and B, when they hold back and they are running the household?
um so it is the case that women in Indian households largely bear the responsibility of financial management or money
Mm,
management within the
mm.
household. And this is also true of low-income households, by the way,
Yes.
that women are pretty much doing much of the money management, much of the cash flow management.
Mm,
Now, that does not mean that women have uh, a say on where the money gets spent. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The within the household, what is happening between the man and the woman will determine how much agency the woman has to do what she would like to do with the money. Generally, economics research shows that when women do have uh, uh, the capacity to allocate savings to the kinds of ends that they would like to allocate it to, the household tends to benefit, meaning that a woman in a household will typically spend on on her children, on
mm.
their nutrition, on their schooling, etc. I mean, this is I would argue, I'm generalizing, and this is the stereotypical understanding of
Yeah.
woman, not just in India, everywhere in the world. The
Mm-hmm.
stereotypical understanding is that the woman cares for the family, the man cares for himself. You know, so now, so I don't know if the dharmic perspective, I mean, if dharmic culture has any specific perspective on this, I would say that dharmic culture definitely has a well-defined perspective on family and what the role of the wife and the husband are within a family. I don't think dharmic culture necessarily would bar women from entering the workforce. Women are free
Mm.
to enter the workforce. Dharmic culture would say that that is fine. But dharmic culture would definitely have something to say about what household savings should be channeled into. And yeah, and to the extent that a woman is uh, uh you know uh and here you'd have to really think about sex differences in psychology to under or
Correct.
personality
Mm.
to say that, okay, maybe the woman in the household, if she were allocating the savings, she might end up allocating them towards the family's uh
Well-being.
towards familial objectives and familial
Mm-hmm.
well-being. Now, it could be that the man has granted the woman that, or they have uh, collectively between themselves, the man and the woman, the husband and the wife, have arrived at an understanding where it is the wife's responsibility to make that decision. Uh, it's very difficult to know what happens within households. Much of the discourse about families today and a lot of the policy discourse also is also so colored by the Western lens
Yeah.
of women getting a bad deal all the time, always, everywhere, that that you end up with these kinds of stereotypical understandings of what of a woman's role in the household.
Mm-hmm.
I think that dharmic culture would be perfectly or okay with whatever decision the woman in the household were to make, whether for herself or for her children. As long as those decisions, and this would be true of a dharmic perspective on the man's responsibility as well within the household. Like I said, in dharmic culture, any human being is considered to have four legitimate strivings:
Yeah.
dharma, artha, kama, moksha. So, as long as whether it is the man or the woman, as long as these are the strivings that the family is undertaking, then that is blessed. That has the blessings of dharmic culture. So, are these strivings more likely to happen if the woman were the head of the household, or if the woman were in charge of finances, or are they more likely to happen if the man were the head of the household or the man were in charge of finance? I don't know. It's difficult to tell. But overall, I think everything that dharmic culture would prescribe for a man or a woman or a husband or a wife has to be seen within the context of this overarching set of objectives, ends, goals that dharmic culture believes are worthy objectives, goals for any human subject to strive for. And therefore, not just the husband and the wife to strive for, but also for the husband and the wife to create the conditions for their children to strive for
Yeah.
in the future.
So talking about the same thing about women participating in the workforce, their employability often is not just determined by their qualifications, but also about, how eventually she would want to start a family, and then the maternity
Mhm.
leaves and everything would come in the way. But from a dharmic lens, you cannot expect the woman to not want a family, because then that has
Yeah,
greater social, ramifications. But at the
yeah,
same time, a woman's personal wealth and financial independence is also then, it comes under great in
yeah, yeah,
dire dependency over the other if she
yeah.
doesn't become a part of the workforce. So how does the dharmic perspective take care of this dilemma?
So first of all, the dharmic perspective would insist that the man and the woman come together into a union that is somehow um, appropriate for them. Okay. Uh, now, because without that foundation, all of these other questions will arise. That the woman needs to be financially independent, but is unable to be financially independent if she has household work to take care of, or if she's raising a family, etc. Dharmic culture, first and foremost, sees the coming together of a man and a woman as husband and wife as something that is, in some sense, ordained. So it is, now if that is how the marriage is happening in the first place, if the marriage itself is happening according to a dharmic uh, within dharmic parameters, then some of these, I would say, some of these questions need not arise, because within those parameters, already there are certain safeguards for the woman to be dependent and at the same time uh, happy and sufficiently cared for, and for the husband to do whatever it is that the husband is doing, or vice versa. I don't think that a dharmic perspective would say that a woman's place is in the home, and a man's place is, in the marketplace or anything like that. But we have to see this. We have to take a step back and look at the overall context where the dharmic perspective the dharmic perspective comes in at the level of the overall context, that if under what conditions are the man and the woman coming together as husband and wife. Is that happening according to dharmic parameters? If that is happening according to dharmic parameters, then I think that family anyway is on a different kind of trajectory than a family where the man and the woman are coming together pure out of you know they're coming together on the basis of an entirely different set of circumstances. you know
So a dharmic economy or a dharmic perspective wouldn't really penalize the man or the woman from
No.
undertaking their dharmic duty as the wife and the husband and then the
Yes,
parent,
swadharma, right?
right?
So the
Yeah.
dharmic perspective would always say that find your swadharma, both to both man and wife, to both husband and wife. The dharmic perspective would say that find a guru, first of all, and then start yoga, start some kind of yogic practice, so that the objective of yogic practice is to basically discover your swadharma, which is your dharma. And so I think the dharmic perspective would have no problem allowing the husband and the wife to both be in, because the understanding is also that both are in spiritual practice as well, right? So if we divorce the situation from all of those other requirements that a dharmic perspective would require, then it's anybody's guess, who should do what and what's the right approach. But if the context is one where both the husband and the wife are striving for moksha, striving for artha, for kama, for uh, and to discover their swadharma, then if the swadharma of the woman is to enter the workforce and the swadharma of the man is to be a stay-at-home dad, then so be it. That is the swadharma for that couple.
So oftentimes we have been told that the motto of our economy is Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. So now that the farmer protests are going on upon the implementation of the Swaminathan report, do you think it is in keeping with, like I would personally assume that in a dharmic perspective, we would also have farmers being put on the same pedestal as we do today. So do you think that their demands right now are correct and does the Swaminathan report does have the right observations?
Hmm. That is, I don't know too much about that topic, to be honest. My senses, look, my senses, and this is an uneducated guess, that a lot of what is happening with the farmers' protests is is purely political in nature. That that there is an election coming up, and prior to the election, there is generally a state of agitation that we can expect in the country from various quarters of troublemakers and agitators. And this is very much part of all of that. I don't know if there is a strong, genuine economic basis for these farmers' protests. When yeah, I did study the matter when these farmers' protests first happened, uh, uh, which was 2 years ago.
Yes.
Uh, and at that time, I thought, at least on based on my reading of the economics of the situation, that the farmers' protests had not much substance in them. That the economics of the reforms that were being suggested were sound, and that the protests were once again more of a political matter than having any firm economic basis. So I think what you're seeing in round two is more of the same, right? It's not, yeah,
Another question, and this would be the last, sir, as we've taken up much of your time. Uh, Climate preservation from a dharmic lens, because you did say that we have ecological limitations.
yeah. So dharmic lens, like I said, dharma sees time as cyclical. And so there is this notion that human beings organize their lives in a way that is uh, repetitive and ritualistic and cyclical. Now, those cycles and those rituals and those repetitions that we organize our own lives around, according to the dharmic perspective, are in sync with cycles of nature and cycles of the environment around us. So So in a way, the dharmic perspective on climate change is that is to uh, on environmental damage or climate change is to regard the environment as essentially sacred, because the environment is as alive and as divine as the human being, as the human subject. So the dharmic perspective would, of course, now we have environmental damage. And so obviously the dharmic perspective, so what the dharmic perspective would want to perhaps do is re reinstantiate uh, those forms of living that would allow human subjects to once again order their lives in alignment with the cycles of nature, rather than order their lives in alignment with the objective of making more and more money. So once you order your life in alignment with what is happening in the natural environment around you, then naturally that is from the very beginning, it makes for sustainability, it makes for preservation, it makes for conservation. Okay, so that is the dharmic perspective, because in according to dharmic perspective, nature is divine, and even inanimate objects are divine. We have divinized everything. We have divinized forests, lakes, rivers, mountains, stones. Everything is divine. So when you have, and the nature of divinity is that, it is that we have to live our lives in yeah, there is a rhythm that we have to fall in step with, and that rhythm is both the rhythm of our own biological selves and also the rhythm of nature. So there is, so this living in sync with natural cycles and and the natural environment hard codes sustainability, conservation, preservation from the very beginning itself. So then this whole problem of externalities does not arise. You see, the problem of externalities arises because you treat nature as foreign, as something to be uh, vanquished or conquered. Dharmic perspective doesn't look at nature in that way.
We believe in embodying truth, which is lived truth, whereas the West believes in disembodying truth, which is
Yeah,
truth entrapped in tomes, is my most prized takeaway from
yeah,
the talk today, as well as that sermons on ethics shall always be the contents ordained by our gurus. Thank you very
yes,
much, sir. It has
yeah.
been an extremely insightful talk, and we wish to have more such talks with you. Namaste.
Namaste.